They say the truth refuses to stay buried, but what if it was hidden in plain sight beneath a layer of soil silence and a script rehearsed to perfection? We all know the official story: a holiday dinner, an open window, and a child vanished into the night. But what if that night was not the beginning of the mystery, but the final act of a cover-up? What if the timeline the world believes is wrong by 24 hours from a mother's secret diary entry marking the night of all nights to a hidden camera capturing a father's solitary return to a remote hillside shrine? This is the story of the evidence that was washed away and the silence that has held firm for 17 years. We are about to walk the path the police never took and expose the secrets hidden in the shadows of the Algarve. If you are ready to look beyond the headlines and question everything you have been told, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel right now. You do not want to miss what comes next. The story the world knows is a story of sudden absence. It is a narrative that begins with a meal and ends with a scream, a timeline compressed into a few frantic hours on the evening of May 3rd, 2007. This version of events has been repeated until it has solidified into something resembling history. We are told of a routine evening, a casual dinner among friends, a periodic check on sleeping children, and then the abyss. A window open, a shutter raised, a bed empty. It is a terrifying sequence because it strikes at the primal fear of every parent, the idea that safety is an illusion that can be shattered in the span of a single heartbeat. However, narratives are not always mirrors of reality. Often they are constructions. They are assembled from the fragments of memory that people choose to share and the pieces they choose to withhold. When the global media descended upon the small coastal town in Portugal, they were hungry for a story of immediate tragedy. They wanted the timeline of the abduction, the description of the stranger in the shadows, the frantic search through the night. They focused entirely on the chaos of the immediate aftermath. In doing so, they may have looked right past the truth. They were watching the curtain rise on the final act, unaware that the play had arguably begun long before the audience arrived. To understand what truly happened, one must look away from the chaotic noise of May 3rd. One must ignore the police tape and the press conferences and the televised pleas for help. Instead, one must look at the silence. One must look at the days leading up to the alarm, at the behavior that went unnoticed because it seemed mundane. This is where the investigation of Bert Stalander began. He was not a man easily swayed by public emotion. A retired military police officer with a mind sharpened by years of deconstructing deception, Stalander did not view the case through the lens of a tragedy. He viewed it through the lens of a system. And systems, he knew, do not simply collapse without warning. Stalander operated on a simple, chilling premise: the official timeline was a fabrication designed to hide a reality that was too difficult to confront. He did not believe that a predator had watched the apartment from the shadows, waiting for a gap of mere minutes in the parents' checking routine. That scenario relied on too many variables, too much chance. Instead, Stalander looked for patterns of control. He looked for evidence of a script. When he scrutinized the witness statements provided by the group of friends dining together, the so-called Tapas 7, he did not see the messy, chaotic contradictions of genuine trauma. He saw order. He saw a sequence of events that fit together with an unnatural precision, like the gears of a clock that had been wound by a careful hand. The accepted history tells us that the crisis began at 10 o'clock in the evening on May 3rd. But what if the crisis was already hours or even days old by the time the alarm was raised? This is the question that haunts the edges of the case. It suggests that the frantic search was not the beginning of the nightmare, but the maintenance of it. It implies that the parents and their friends were not reacting to a fresh horror, but were navigating a situation they had already been living with for 24 hours. Consider the atmosphere of the group in those critical days. To the outside observer, they were a picture of upper-middle-class relaxation. They played tennis, they jogged, they dined. But beneath the veneer of leisure, small anomalies began to drift to the surface like wreckage from a submerged vessel. Staff at the resort noted a strange tension, a distance that seemed at odds with the joy of a family holiday. There were moments where the masks slipped. A waiter would later recall a listening device left unattended at a dinner table for an extended period, a device supposedly there to monitor crying children, yet left behind while parents were absent. Why would someone leave a monitor on a table if its sole purpose was to alert them to distress, unless of course the monitor was no longer needed because the silence in the room was already guaranteed? Stellander's focus narrowed in on the day prior, May 2nd. This date, he believed, was the true epicenter of the event. While the world focused on the Thursday of the disappearance, Stalander looked at the Wednesday. He examined the diaries, the photographs, and the witness accounts from that specific 24-hour window. He found a distinct shift in tone. The interactions changed. The relaxed fluidity of the holiday seemed to freeze into a rigid structure. It was as if the group had stopped living the holiday and had started performing it. The concept of the night of all nights emerged from this analysis. It was a phrase found in the personal writings of the mother, a description of May 2nd that carried a heavy, unexplained emotional weight. Why would a Wednesday a day supposedly indistinguishable from the rest of the vacation be marked with such profound significance? In the context of a living child, the phrase is puzzling. In the context of a loss, it becomes a marker. It suggests that the emotional climax of the trip occurred a full day before the police were called. If the child had indeed died on May 2nd, perhaps through a tragic accident in the apartment, a fall, or a medical reaction, then everything that followed was not life but the simulation of life. This theory transforms the events of May 3rd entirely. If the child was already gone, then the dinner at the Tapas restaurant was not a social gathering. It was an alibi parade. The regular checks on the apartment every 30 minutes like clockwork were not to ensure the safety of a sleeping child, but to establish a witness timeline for the missing individual. It explains the rigidity of the statements. It explains why the friends were so certain of times and details that usually blur in memory. They were not recalling a memory. They were reciting a timeline that had been agreed upon. Stellander's investigation was not an exercise in malice. He did not view the parents as monsters who harmed their child with intent. Rather, he viewed them through the lens of human fallibility and panic. He understood that when reputable people with careers and reputations face a sudden catastrophic accident, the instinct is not always to confess. Sometimes the instinct is to fix it, to buy time, to control the narrative until a solution can be found. And in that gap between the accident and the admission, a lie can take root and grow until it becomes too massive to ever dismantle. The silence of the holiday apartment was not the silence of sleep. It was the silence of absence. As the sun rose on the morning of May 3rd, the stage was set. The characters took their places. The tennis matches were played, the children were taken to the kids' club, the smiles were exchanged for cameras. But to the analytical eye of Bert Stalander, it was all hollow. He saw the parents not as grieving victims in waiting, but as directors of a complex play, moving pieces across a board, ensuring that when the moment came to screen, the world would see exactly what they wanted it to see. The true mystery, then, is not who took the child. The mystery is what happened in the quiet hours before the world was watching. It is a story of a timeline manipulated, a grief delayed, and a secret buried beneath the frantic activity of a search that was never meant to find anything. The investigation into the disappearance is in reality an investigation into a performance. And like all performances, it required rehearsal. It required cues, and most importantly, it required an audience willing to believe the illusion. As the hours ticked toward the inevitable alarm, the tension within the group must have been suffocating, a silent scream held behind tight lips, waiting for the signal to be released. This was not a crime in progress. It was a cover-up in motion. And it all hinged on the world believing that the clock started on May 3rd when in reality, the hands had stopped moving the day before. In the vast archive of evidence that surrounds the disappearance, there is one date that has been systematically overshadowed. The world has scrutinized the evening of May 3rd with a microscopic intensity, dissecting every minute of the timeline from the moment the last drink was poured to the moment the alarm was raised. Yet for the independent investigator Bert Stalander, the key to unlocking the mystery lay not in the chaos of the Thursday, but in the peculiar silence of the Wednesday. May 2nd, 2007 stands as the ghost in the machine of the official narrative, A day that should have been unremarkable yet carries the weight of a turning point that no one was ever supposed to see. The central piece of evidence that anchors this theory is not forensic but linguistic. It comes from the personal diary of the mother, Kate McCann. Diaries are intimate spaces, repositories of the mundane and the profound, where the writer speaks to themselves without the filter of public expectation. Throughout the holiday, the entries had been largely logistical lists of tennis matches, notes on the weather, observations about the children's activities. They were the ordinary records of a family vacation. But on May 2nd, the tone shifted abruptly. The mundane dissolved into the metaphysical. In her entry for that day, she referred to it as the night of all nights. This phrase, the night of all nights, sits on the page like a heavy stone. In standard conversation, such a description is reserved for events of monumental significance, a wedding, a birth, a life-changing celebration. Yet according to the official story, nothing happened on May 2nd. It was simply another day of sun and leisure. Why then would a mother mark it with such a definitive superlative label to Staylander? This was an example of psychological leakage. It was an acknowledgement that the emotional apex of the trip had already occurred. It suggested that something irreversible had taken place in the quiet hours of that Wednesday, transforming an ordinary evening into a defining moment of their lives. The entry did not stop at that cryptic title. The writing poured out with an intensity that had been absent from previous pages. She wrote directly to her daughter using language that bordered on the devotional. She called her my sweetheart, my love, my companion. She wrote, "I love you more than anything." And then a sentence that chills the blood of those who view the case through a skeptical lens: "I is going to dream that I is lying by your side." It reads less like a diary entry for a sleeping child and more like a eulogy for a departed one. It is a farewell penned in the present tense, a desperate attempt to hold onto a connection that has already been severed. If the child was alive and well, sleeping safely in the next room, why the sudden overwhelming need to memorialize her presence in such final terms? Staylander's analysis posits that this diary entry was not written in anticipation of a new day, but in the aftermath of a tragedy. If the child had died accidentally on May 2nd, perhaps a fall, a medication error, or an unforeseen medical event, the grief of the mother would have been fresh, raw, and consuming. But she could not speak it aloud. The narrative of the abduction had to be constructed. The silence had to be maintained. And so the diary became the only outlet, a safe harbor where she could whisper the goodbye that she was forbidden to scream. This theory of a prior event is supported by more than just words on a page. The behavior of the parents on the evening of May 2nd also deviates sharply from the routine they later claimed was sacrosanct. During the dinner at the tapas restaurant that night, the rhythm of the group was broken. Witnesses, including restaurant staff, recalled that the father, Jerry McCann, was absent from the table for a significant duration. Estimates ranged from 15 minutes to over half an hour. The mother, Kate, also left the table shortly after. These absences contradict the rigid checking routine they later insisted upon. If they were checking the children every 20 or 30 minutes, why was the father gone for so long? And why, when the timeline was reconstructed for the police, did these long absences vanish from the official account? The discrepancy suggests a crisis management operation was already underway. If a tragic accident had occurred earlier that day or evening, the parents would have been faced with an impossible choice: call the authorities and face the potential legal and professional consequences in a foreign legal system, or conceal the event. Staylander believes they chose the latter. The long absences from dinner were not for checking on sleeping children, but for dealing with the tragic reality. They were moments of frantic planning, of stabilization, of ensuring that the immediate environment did not betray the secret they were now forced to carry. This perspective also sheds light on the mother's demeanor in the days and weeks that followed. Police investigators and behavioral analysts were often struck by her controlled state. She was described as calm, almost detached. When faced with aggressive questioning or the intense glare of the media, she did not dissolve into the hysteria one might expect from a mother whose child had been snatched by a predator. Instead, she remained composed. Her answers polished her emotions contained behind a wall of steel. To the public, this was presented as strength. To Staylander, it was a defense mechanism born of necessity. If she were truly reacting to a sudden abduction on May 3rd, the shock would have been fresh, the panic unmanageable. But if the loss had occurred on May 2nd, she had already had 24 hours to process the initial trauma. She had already moved from the phase of shock to the phase of survival. By the time the police were called on the night of the 3rd, she was not experiencing the event, she was managing the aftermath. Her calm was not a lack of feeling, but a suppression of it, a desperate effort to keep the mask from slipping. The night of all nights was the turning point where the family holiday ended and the operation began. It was the night the truth was sealed away, replaced by a fiction that would be rehearsed and repeated until it became indistinguishable from fact. The diary entry stands as a solitary monument to that hidden reality, a crack in the facade where the light of truth briefly shines through. It tells us that the grieving did not start when the world was told it started. It began in the dark, in the silence, on a night that no one was supposed to remember. If the previous day was the turning point and the evening of May 3rd was the performance. In the annals of criminal investigation, witness statements are rarely perfect. Human memory is a fragile, chaotic thing. When a group of people witnesses an event or recalls a timeline, there are usually jagged edges, disagreements on times, confusion about sequences, variations in perspective. But when investigators began to examine the statements provided by the group known as the Tapas 7, the friends dining with the parents on the night of the disappearance, they found something unsettling. They did not find the messiness of truth. They found the sleek, polished surface of a script. The narrative put forth by the group was one of disciplined routine. They claimed that they were dining at the restaurant mere yards from the apartment, and that every 30 minutes one of them would leave the table to check on the sleeping children. This system was presented as the backbone of their defense, a shield against the accusation of neglect. However, when linguistic analysts and independent investigators like Bert Stalander laid these statements side by side, the similarities were uncanny. The descriptions of the lighting in the rooms, the positions of the doors, the routes taken, they aligned with a precision that defied statistical probability. This phenomenon is known as artificial synchronicity. It occurs when a group has agreed upon a version of events beforehand, memorizing key details to ensure their stories do not diverge. In a genuine crisis, people remember feelings and fragments. In a fabricated one, they remember the agreed-upon facts. But even the best rehearsed scripts have flaws, and the cracks in the Tapas 7 story began to show not in what they said, but in what others saw. Restaurant staff and other diners observed a reality that contradicted the routine check narrative. Waiters noted that members of the group, particularly the men, were absent from the table for long stretches of time intervals, far exceeding the few minutes required to walk to an apartment and back. One man was gone for over half an hour. Another returned just as the group was preparing to leave. These were not quick checks. These were significant absences. What were they doing during these long windows of time if the timeline was so rigid? Why did the physical movements of the players not match the schedule they later swore to? Perhaps the most damning detail was a small, overlooked object. A witness recalled seeing a listening device, a baby monitor or walkie-talkie left sitting on the dining table unattended. The parents and their friends had insisted that they were checking physically because the monitors would not work through the thick walls. Yet here was a monitor switched on, sitting amongst the wine glasses and plates. If they were checking in person, why was the monitor there? And more disturbingly, if the monitor was there linked to the children, why was it left alone on the table while members of the group were absent? A monitor that no one is listening to is a prop. Its presence suggests that the checking was theater, a visual display for the benefit of observers, while the reality of the situation, that the silence in the apartment was already absolute, was known to those at the table. The behavior of the group during the dinner was described by some observers as strained, by others as oddly detached. There was a tension that did not fit the setting of a relaxed holiday farewell. When the alarm was finally raised, the reaction was equally perplexing. There was no immediate explosion of collective hysteria that one would expect from a group of close friends realizing a child was missing. Instead, there was a strange, muted quality to the initial moments. It was as if the cue had been given and the actors were stepping into their roles, but the emotion was not quite reaching their eyes. They moved with purpose, but it was the purpose of containment, not discovery. Stellander concluded that the dinner on May 3rd was not a meal but a final briefing. It was the time when the timeline was solidified, when the alibis were synchronized, and when the group steeled themselves for the storm they were about to unleash. The inconsistencies in their statements, the differing accounts of who checked whom, the confusion over whether doors were locked or unlocked, were not signs of forgetfulness. They were the friction marks of a story being forced over the rough ground of reality. The rehearsal was over. The curtain was about to rise, and the world was about to be told a story that had been written to hide the truth of what lay in the silence of the night before. To build a lie that lasts for decades, one must anchor it in the physical world. It is not enough to simply say you were somewhere. You must prove it. You must leave a footprint, a digital echo, a memory in the mind of a stranger. This is the concept of controlled visibility. It is a tactic often used in intelligence and military operations to establish a presence in a specific location so that future movements in that area seem normal, routine, and unsuspicious. On the morning of May 2nd, the day before the official disappearance, Jerry McCann and his friend David Payne engaged in exactly this kind of operation, disguised as a morning jog. A photograph exists of this moment. It shows the two men running along a dusty path near the church, bathed in the morning sunlight. On the surface, it is a banal holiday snapshot. But for Bert Stellander, this image was a tactical map. Why document a run? Why this specific route? And why weeks later would the father write a blog post detailing this exercise with such specific, unnecessary granularity? In his online entry, Jerry McCann described the route as winding and challenging, stating that it took them 19 minutes to complete. He noted the terrain, the scenery, the effort. It was a lot of detail for a casual jog. Stellander, driven by his suspicion of the timeline, decided to test this claim physically. He traveled to the location, stood at the exact starting point, and ran the route himself. He did not sprint. He maintained a steady average pace for a man of similar age and fitness. When he crossed the finish line, he stopped his stopwatch. The time was not 19 minutes. It was 12 minutes. 7 minutes. In the context of a marathon, 7 minutes is negligible. In the context of a murder investigation or a cover-up, 7 minutes is an eternity. A 7-minute discrepancy in a short run suggests that the time was padded. Why exaggerate the duration of the run? Stellander believed the answer lay in the destination. The route they took led past the church and towards the secluded hillsides east of the resort, the very area where Stellander would later find the shrine known as Spot 1. The theory of the dry run posits that the morning jog was not for fitness, but for reconnaissance. By running this route in broad daylight, wearing distinct sportswear and capturing it on camera, the men were establishing a pattern. They were planting a seed in the minds of anyone who saw them. We run here. We use these paths. If you see us here again, perhaps at dusk or dawn, do not be alarmed. It is just our routine. It normalized their presence in a location that would later become critical to the concealment of the truth. If the child had died the previous night, as Stellander suspected, the morning of May 2nd would have been a time of frantic logistical planning. The body would need to be moved from a temporary hiding place to a more secure location. The hills offered seclusion, but accessing them carried risk. The jog reduced that risk. It allowed them to scout the terrain, to check for sightlines, to see where the ground was soft and where the shadows fell. The 7-minute gap in the blog post was not a memory error. It was narrative engineering. It stretched the timeline to account for stops for discussions, perhaps for the identification of a burial site. The blog post itself serves as a retrospective alibi. By writing about the run, weeks later, the father was reinforcing the fitness narrative, cementing the idea that the hills were nothing more than a scenic backdrop for exercise. But the physics of the run betrayed the story. The discrepancy in time opened a doorway into the psychology of the men. They were trying to control the perception of space and time, to weave a safety net out of minutes and meters. But the net had a hole. And through that hole, the investigator could see the calculated intent of men who were not running for their health, but running to clear a path for the darkness that was to come. The sun set on May 3rd, casting long shadows over the white walls of the resort. To the casual observer, the evening was unfolding with the predictable rhythm of a holiday town. Families were retreating from the pools, dinners were being prepared, wine was being uncorked. But inside the circle of the McCanns and their friends, the atmosphere was charged with a frequency that only they could hear. The official story tells of a sudden shattering of peace at 10 o'clock. But the observations of those on the periphery, the staff, the other guests, tell a story of a strange, eerie calm that preceded the storm. When the alarm was finally raised, the expected human reaction to the abduction of a child is visceral. It is loud. It is chaotic. It involves screaming, running, a total collapse of social decorum. Yet, witnesses described a scene that was oddly contained. An elderly woman from the group approached the restaurant staff, not with the frantic desperation of a grandmother, but with a flat, composed demeanor. She informed them that a child was missing. The rest of the group sat or stood in a silence that felt heavy, almost rehearsed. There was no explosion of movement. There was instead a sense of waiting. This collective freezing behavior is inconsistent with the shock of a sudden external trauma. When a predator strikes from the dark, the reaction is fight or flight, panic, aggression, hysteria. But when a group is executing a plan, the reaction is often suppression. They are processing the next step in the script, not the horror of the moment. They are monitoring their own behavior, ensuring they do not overact or underact. The silence observed by the staff was the silence of people who were concentrating. The behavior of the mother, Kate McCann, during this immediate aftermath was particularly scrutinized. While she did eventually display distress, the initial moments were marked by a lack of urgency that baffled investigators. She returned to the group at the table. Discussions were held. The police were not called immediately upon the discovery of the empty bed. There was a lag, a gap of time where the group conferred. Why, if a child is gone, every second is a lifetime? Unless the child has been gone for a long time, and the discovery is merely the signal to begin the public phase of the ordeal. Stellander analyzed this calm as a sign of prior knowledge. The group was not processing new information. They were initiating a protocol. The lack of chaos was due to the fact that the chaos had already been internalized and dealt with hours, perhaps days earlier. By the evening of May 3rd, the emotional shock of the death had faded into the cold resolve of self-preservation. They were no longer parents and friends. They were co-conspirators in a narrative of survival. As the night deepened and the search began, a search that many in the group knew was futile, the strange detachment persisted. They searched in places where a child could not be. They avoided looking in places where a body could be. The search itself became a performance of looking, rather than an act of finding. The calm before the storm was not peace, it was the holding of breath. It was the terrifying stillness of a group of people standing on the edge of a precipice, holding hands and deciding together to jump into the lie. And as the police sirens finally cut through the night air, they knew that there was no turning back. The play had begun, and they would have to stay in character for the rest of their lives. While the world argued over headlines and timelines, a different kind of observer arrived in the Algarve. He came years after the cameras had packed up, long after the satellite trucks had left the dusty parking lots. His name was Bert Staylander. To understand the trajectory of this case, one must understand the man who decided to look where no one else was looking. Staylander was not a journalist chasing a scoop, nor was he a conventional detective bound by the bureaucracy of warrants and protocols. He was a former military police officer from Norway, a man whose career had been built on understanding the rigid structures of order and the messy, chaotic ways in which humans try to subvert them. Staylander operated in the shadows, not out of secrecy, but out of necessity. He believed that the truth of the Madeleine McCann case had been buried under a mountain of noise. The media had created a feedback loop of speculation, sightings, and theories that led nowhere. To find the signal, Staylander knew he had to tune out the static. He did not interview the parents. He did not harass the witnesses. Instead, he studied the environment. He treated the landscape of Praia de Luz not as a holiday resort, but as a crime scene that had been frozen in time. He believed that while people lie, behavior leaves a residue. It stains the earth and the air invisible to the naked eye, but glaringly obvious to someone trained to see the patterns of guilt. His methodology was rooted in a concept he called emotional geography. He posited that, when a crime of passion or a tragic accident is covered up, the perpetrators do not simply walk away. They are bound to the location of the event. They are tethered to it by a complex web of fear, regret, and the psychological need to control the narrative. A kidnapper takes a child and leaves. They have no attachment to the void that remains. But a parent who has lost a child and who has chosen to hide that loss is forever orbiting the site of concealment. They cannot let go. Stellander came to Portugal to find that orbit. He walked the streets alone. He timed the routes. He stood in the silent spaces between the apartments and the sea, asking himself what he would do if he were carrying a burden that could destroy his life. He looked for the path of least resistance, the route that offered the most cover in the shortest amount of time. He analyzed the line of sight from the windows, the reach of the streetlights, the density of the shadows. He was building a psychological profile of the night, in question stripping away the testimony of the Tapas 7 and replacing it with the cold, hard logic of terrain and opportunity. Stellander was an outsider, untouched by the politics of the British or Portuguese investigations. This gave him a dangerous clarity. He did not care about reputations. He did not care about the diplomatic friction between nations. He cared only about the anomaly, and as he immersed himself in the case files, scrutinizing the forgotten details that others had dismissed as irrelevant, he began to see a shape emerging from the fog. It was not the shape of a stranger creeping through a window. It was the shape of a frantic, organized effort to manage a catastrophe. He realized that the key to the mystery was not in the apartment where the child was last seen, but in the desolate, scrub-covered hills that lay just beyond the edge of the town, a place where the lights of the resort faded into the darkness and where secrets could be kept for a lifetime. In the months following the disappearance, amidst the frantic search and the global appeals, a quiet detail emerged from the chaos. It was a detail that most people dismissed as the heartbreaking product of a grieving mother's trauma. Kate McCann reported having a vivid, recurring dream. In this dream, she did not see her daughter in a distant country, nor did she see her in the hands of a stranger. She saw her daughter's body lying on a hillside overlooking the beach of Praia de Luz. To the casual observer, this was a nightmare, a manifestation of the worst fears of a parent. But to Bert Stellander, this was not a dream, it was a map. In the field of criminal psychology, there is a phenomenon known as leakage. The human mind is not designed to hold absolute secrets, especially those laden with profound emotional weight. When the conscious mind is busy constructing a defense, the subconscious often rebels. It seeks release. It pushes the truth to the surface in the form of slips of the tongue, strange behaviors, or in this case, dreams. Stellander asked the question that few dared to voice. Why would a mother who publicly insisted her daughter was alive and had been abducted dream of a specific burial site? If she truly believed the abduction narrative, her nightmares should have been filled with escape, attempts with sightings with the face of the abductor. The specificity of the hillside overlooking the beach was jarring. It suggested a knowledge of location that contradicted her public stance. It was as if a part of her was trying to tell the world where to look, even while her waking self was directing them elsewhere. The investigator analyzed the geography of the dream. Praia de Luz is surrounded by hills, but the description narrowed the search field significantly. It pointed to the high ground to the east, an area that offered a vantage point over the ocean and the town. This was not a random location generated by a sleeping brain. It was a place that existed in the physical world. Stellander believed that the dream was actually a memory distorted and repackaged by trauma. It was a memory of a final goodbye, a memory of a location where the frantic activity of the cover-up had come to a rest. This concept of psychological leakage suggests that the parents were trapped in a duality. They were fighting to maintain the fiction of the abduction, to save their remaining family and their freedom, but they were also crushed by the reality of their loss. The dream was the bridge between these two worlds. It was a cry for help that could be safely categorized as a nightmare, allowing the mother to speak the truth without confessing to it. Stalander viewed this not as evidence of malice, but as evidence of a desperate, fractured psyche. The location was calling to her, and through her it was calling to him. He realized that if he wanted to find the answers, he did not need to listen to the press conferences. He needed to follow the geography of the mother's grief. He needed to find the hill from the dream. Guided by the coordinates of the subconscious map, Stalander began his physical search. He did not bring dogs or ground-penetrating radar. He brought only his eyes and his understanding of human ritual. He hiked the rugged terrain east of the resort, moving through the tall grass and the rocky outcrops. He was looking for something that did not belong. Nature is chaotic. It scatters stones and debris at random. Humans are creatures of order. Even in their haste, they create patterns. It was in March of 2017 that he found it. He called it Spot 1. It was a secluded area hidden from the main path by the natural curvature of the land, yet offering a sweeping view of the ocean and the town below exactly as described in the dream. But it was not the view that stopped Stalander in his tracks. It was the arrangement on the ground. There, amidst the wild scrub, was a collection of stones. They were not scattered. They had been deliberately placed to form a distinct shape, a heart. Inside the heart, someone had placed a fresh pink flower. And near it, formed from broken twigs and branches, was the letter M. The air around the site felt heavy, charged with a silence that was different from the surrounding hills. This was not a random pile of rocks. This was a shrine. A shrine implies devotion. It implies return. It implies that someone loved the person represented by that letter M enough to hike up this difficult terrain, perhaps under the cover of darkness, to maintain this memorial. A kidnapper does not build a shrine. A stranger does not leave flowers. These are the acts of those who mourn. Stalander stood over the site, his military training warring with the profound sadness of the scene. The presence of the fresh flower was the most telling detail. It meant the site was active. It was being visited. The emotional residue he had come to Portugal to find had manifested in physical form. The heart of stones was a message, a symbol of love left in a desolate place where no one was supposed to look. He realized then that the case was not cold. It was alive. The narrative of the abduction was a shell, but here on this hillside, the heart of the mystery was beating. The discovery of Spot 1 shifted the investigation from a search for a missing person to a surveillance of a specific location. Stalander knew that whoever had placed those stones would return. They could not stay away. The pull of the grave or the memorial to it would be too strong to resist. He had found the stage. Now he just had to wait for the actors to appear. He did not touch the stones. He did not disturb the flower. He simply backed away, his mind already racing with the logistics of the trap he was about to set. The hillside had whispered its secret, and he intended to capture the echo on camera. Bert Stalander stood on the edge of a revelation, but he knew that discovery alone was not proof. In the world of criminal investigation, finding a location is only half the battle. One must prove the connection between the location and the subject. The shrine at Spot 1 was compelling: the heart of stones, the pink flower, the letter constructed from twigs, but without a link to the parents it remained circumstantial. It could have been dismissed as a coincidence, a bizarre artifact left by a stranger. Stalander needed to forge that link. He needed to see who claimed ownership of that isolated patch of earth. To do this, he engineered a psychological experiment. He did not rely on the heavy hand of the law, which had long since moved on from the hills of Praia da Luz. Instead, he relied on technology and human nature. He returned to the hillside not to disturb the shrine, but to watch it. He installed a series of motion-activated trail cameras. These devices were small, camouflaged, and capable of recording in low light. They were the silent eyes that would never blink, positioned to capture the face of anyone who felt compelled to visit this hidden memorial. But a camera is passive. It waits for an event that might never happen. Stalander needed to be active. He needed to provoke a reaction. He drew upon his experience in military intelligence to craft a strategy known as behavioral triggering. The premise is simple. If a subject is hiding a secret, they live in a state of constant low-level anxiety. They are terrified of discovery. If you introduce a stimulus that suggests discovery is imminent, their anxiety spikes and they are forced to act. They must verify the safety of their secret. Stellander composed an email. It was sent anonymously to the parents. The message was deliberately vague. It contained no threats, no demands for money, and no specific coordinates. It simply whispered a suggestion that the place was known, that the secret was about to be unearthed. "It is about to be discovered" was the essence of the message. It was a bluff, a ghost story told to haunt the conscience of those who knew the truth. The brilliance of this trap lay in its binary outcome. If the parents were innocent victims of a kidnapping, such a message would be meaningless or at most confusing. They might hand it over to the police as a cruel hoax. They certainly would not know where to look because they would have no knowledge of a hiding place. But if they were maintaining a cover-up, the message would be a siren. It would bypass their logic and strike directly at their fear. It would force them to ask the terrifying question, have they found it? And to answer that question, they would have to go there. They would have to return to spot one to see for themselves if the stones had been moved, if the earth had been disturbed. Stellander set the digital trap and stepped back. He did not need to be physically present. He simply needed to wait. The hillside was now a stage, the cameras were the audience, and the email was the cue. If no one came, his theory was wrong. But if someone did come, if the parents appeared on that remote path, miles from where they should be looking for a secret that wasn't supposed to exist, then the silence of the last decade would finally be broken. The cameras waited. Days turned into nights, and the digital eyes recorded nothing but the movement of the wind and the passage of small animals. But then the pattern broke. The sensors triggered. The shutter clicked. And when Stellander reviewed the footage, the image that stared back at him confirmed his darkest suspicions. It was not a hiker lost on the trail. It was not a local farmer. It was Jerry McCann. The father appeared on the path leading to spot one. He was alone. His demeanor was not that of a man exercising or sightseeing. He moved with a specific driven purpose. He did not look at the view. He looked at the ground. He walked directly to the area where the stones were arranged. He stood there silent and solitary in the middle of the desolate landscape. The footage captured him looking around, scanning the horizon, perhaps checking to see if he was being watched. He was inspecting the site. This was the reaction Stellander had predicted, but seeing it unfold on screen was chilling. This visit occurred shortly after the email was sent. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. But the father was not the only one. Over the following weeks and months, the cameras captured a parade of familiar faces. Kate McCann appeared sometimes alone, sometimes with her husband. Friends from the original group, the Tapa 7, were also recorded in the vicinity. They came at odd hours. They came without the fanfare that usually accompanied their public appearances. There were no press photographers, no police escorts, no banners asking for information. They were not there to search for a missing child. A search implies looking in new places. They were returning to an old place. They moved through the scrub with the familiarity of people who knew exactly where they were going. They checked the stones. They stood in silence. They left. The most damning aspect of these visits was not just their presence, but their silence. If an innocent father receives a tip that his daughter might be found in a specific location, his first instinct is to scream for help. He calls the police. He brings excavation teams. He demands that the earth be turned over until he finds an answer. He does not go alone quietly to stare at a pile of rocks and then leave without telling a soul. The fact that they never reported these visits to the authorities was to Stellander the final piece of the puzzle. It was proof of a parallel investigation, or rather a parallel management operation. They were managing the site. They were ensuring that the sanctuary remained undisturbed. The anonymous email had panicked them not into seeking justice, but into seeking reassurance that their secret was still safe. The footage showed a group of people bound together by a shared gravitation toward this specific point on the map. They were drawn back to it again and again. The camera captured the father, placing a hand on a stone, a gesture of intimacy that spoke volumes. It was a gesture of acknowledgement. In that moment, the hillside ceased to be a landscape and became a grave. The return was not a search, it was a pilgrimage. And every time they walked up that hill, they were unknowingly testifying against themselves. Why do they go back? This is the question that baffles the rational mind. If one has committed the perfect crime or the perfect cover-up, the logical course of action is to put as much distance as possible between oneself and the evidence. You walk away. You forget. You never look back. To return is to court disaster. It invites suspicion, it risks exposure. Yet the trail cameras at Spot 1 proved that the McCanns and their inner circle defied this logic. They returned repeatedly, obsessively over a span of years. Stellander turned to criminal psychology to explain this paradox. He found his answer in a concept he termed romanticizing the grave. This theory suggests that for individuals who are not career criminals, but rather ordinary people trapped in a catastrophic lie, the location of the body takes on a profound, almost sacred significance. When a death is accidental and the subsequent cover-up is born of panic and self-preservation, the guilt is complex. It is not the cold, predatory guilt of a murderer. It is a defensive guilt mixed with genuine, overwhelming grief. The parents cannot mourn publicly for the child they lost on May 2nd because to do so would be to admit that the official story of May 3rd is a lie. They are denied the rituals of death, the funeral, the headstone, the public sympathy for a deceased child. They are forced to perform the role of hopeful parents waiting for a reunion that they know will never happen. This psychological pressure creates a need for a private outlet. Spot 1 became that outlet. It became the only place in the world where they could stop pretending. The heart of stones and the pink flower were not just markers. They were a substitute for the grave they could not dig in a churchyard. Returning to the site allowed them to be near the truth. It allowed them to feel a connection to the daughter they had lost in the place where they had left her. The behavior is a manifestation of what psychologists call undoing a defense mechanism, where a person tries to cancel out an unhealthy, destructive, or threatening thought or action by engaging in contrary behavior. By visiting the site, by tending to the shrine, they are subconsciously trying to make amends for the indignity of the concealment. They are trying to show care to the child in death that they failed to protect in life. This attachment creates a dangerous blind spot. The emotional need to visit the grave overrides the rational need to stay away. They convinced themselves that they were careful, that no one was watching, that a morning jog or a twilight walk was innocent enough to pass unnoticed. They did not account for the fact that their grief had a geographic footprint. Stellander realized that he was not hunting monsters. He was watching tragic figures caught in a loop of their own making. They were prisoners of the hillside. They could travel the world, they could appear on television, they could write books, but their internal compass would always point back to that pile of rocks in Portugal. The shrine was their confession. It stood as a physical testament to the fact that while they had buried the body, they could not bury the bond. They went back because they had to. And in doing so, they revealed to the camera what they could never reveal to the world, that they knew exactly where Madeleine McCann was, because they were the ones who had said goodbye to her there. In the labyrinth of witness statements, timeline discrepancies, and media speculation, words can be twisted. Memories can be reshaped. Alibis can be constructed. But there is one witness that cannot be coached, cannot be bribed, and cannot lie. That witness is biology, specifically the biological signature of death. While the human investigators argued over minutes and motives, a different kind of expert was brought into the case to cut through the noise. These were Eddie and Keela, two highly specialized dogs from the British police force. Eddie was an enhanced victim recovery dog trained to detect the specific scent of human remains, the chemical compound released afterward. Keela was a crime scene dog trained to detect human blood even after it had been scrubbed away. Their arrival marked a pivotal shift in the investigation. Until that moment, the entire premise of the case rested on the assumption of an abduction, that the child had been taken alive from the apartment. But if the dogs alerted, that premise would shatter. A kidnapper does not leave the biological scent behind. Only a fatality does. The dogs were an objective instrument introduced into a subjective chaos. They did not know who the parents were. They did not watch the news. They were driven only by their training and their senses. The examination of the apartment was the first test. It had been weeks since the disappearance. The space had been cleaned, lived in by others, and contaminated by the foot traffic of police and family. To the human eye, it was just a holiday rental. To Eddie, however, the invisible chemical trails were screaming. When he was released into the apartment, his behavior changed immediately. He did not wander aimlessly. He alerted. He barked frantically in two specific locations behind the sofa in the living room and near the wardrobe in the master bedroom. This was not a vague signal. It was a definitive confirmation of the presence of human forensic markers. Keela followed. She alerted to the presence of biological traces in the exact same area behind the sofa. The implications were devastating. For a cadaver dog to alert the scent must be significant. It suggests that a body lay there not for seconds, but for a duration long enough for the chemistry of death to permeate the environment. This evidence directly contradicted the abduction theory. If a stranger had snatched the child from the bed and fled, why was there cadaver scent behind the sofa in the living room? The dogs were telling a story of an event that happened inside the apartment, an event that ended in silence before the alarm was ever raised. But the most damning evidence was yet to come. The investigation moved from the apartment to the vehicles. The police arranged a lineup of cars in a secure garage. There were 10 vehicles in total parked in a row. One of them was a silver Renault Scenic. This car was crucial because it had not been hired by the parents until 25 days after the disappearance. Logically, if the child had been abducted on the night of May 3rd, this car should have been completely sterile. It had never been near the child during her life. It should have held no scent, no history, no connection to the case whatsoever. Eddie was deployed. He moved down the line of cars, ignoring the first few. When he reached the Renault Scenic, he stopped. He alerted aggressively at the driver's door and the trunk. Keela confirmed the finding. She found forensic traces on the keycard and in the boot of the vehicle. The probability of this being a coincidence is statistically non-existent. How could a car rented weeks after the child vanished contain the specific scent of her biological evidence? There is only one explanation that fits the laws of physics and biology: the body was moved. The alert in the car supported the theory that the initial burial was temporary, perhaps in a nearby location like the cemetery or the church grounds, and that the vehicle was later used to transport the remains to a final, more secure location, possibly the remote hillside known as Spot 1. The car was not a transport for a holiday. It was a vessel for concealment. The reaction of the parents to this forensic bombshell was telling. They did not demand an explanation for how their daughter's blood could be in their rental car. Instead, they offered an alternative theory. They claimed that the scent and the fluids picked up by the dogs were the result of leaking groceries. They stated that they had transported raw meat, fish, and shrimp in the trunk and that the contents had leaked onto the carpet. They argued that the dogs were reacting to the smell of rotting food. To a layperson, this might sound plausible. To a forensic expert, it is absurd. Enhanced victim recovery dogs are trained specifically to ignore the scent of animal meat. They are proofed against pork, beef, lamb, and seafood. Their entire purpose is to distinguish between animal and human biological signatures. If a police dog alerted every time it smelled a grocer's bag, it would be useless. Eddie had worked on hundreds of cases finding bodies in concrete, in water, and in vast woodlands. He did not mistake a bag of frozen shrimp for a human child. The rotten meat defense was an attempt to explain away the unexplainable, a desperate narrative patch applied to a gaping hole in the story. DNA analysis was conducted on the samples retrieved from the car. The results were complex. The sample was degraded and mixed, meaning it could not be used as a definitive identification in a court of law. However, the analysis showed that 15 out of 19 genetic markers matched the profile of the missing child. In the world of statistics, a match of 15 markers is incredibly rare. While the law requires certainty, the math suggested probability bordering on fact. The biological ghost of the child was in that trunk. The dogs were eventually dismissed. Their evidence was sidelined, categorized as unreliable by a legal system that struggled to prosecute without a body. But for Bert Stalander, the dogs were the heroes of the investigation. They had provided the invisible thread that connected the apartment, the timeline, and the movement. They proved that the tragic event occurred in the room, not been taken from it. They proved that the body was still in the possession of the perpetrators long after the police had begun their search. The scent of truth is difficult to wash away. You can scrub a floor, you can vacuum a car, you can wash a toy, but the molecular signature of death lingers. It clings to the fibers and it clings to the conscience. The dogs barked, and for a brief moment the silence of the cover-up was broken by the sound of undeniable recognition. In the architecture of this disappearance, the silver Renault Scenic serves as the keystone. For weeks, the investigation had been static, confined to the apartment in the immediate vicinity of the resort. The police were looking for a person who had vanished into thin air, but the introduction of the rental vehicle changed the physics of the case. It transformed a story of static loss into a story of kinetic movement. The car was not hired immediately. It was rented 25 days after the alarm was raised. This specific interval of time, 3.5 weeks, is the silence that screams the loudest. It forces the investigation to ask a terrifying logistical question. If the child died on May 2nd, where was the body during the 25 days before the car was acquired? Bert Stalander's theory provides a grim but logical answer. When a death occurs suddenly and is followed by a panic-induced cover-up, the immediate priority is concealment. However, the initial hiding place is rarely the final one. It is a holding pattern. The perpetrators need a location that is accessible nearby and secure enough to withstand the initial wave of searching. Stalander posited that the body was likely moved to a temporary site in the immediate aftermath, possibly the local church grounds or the village cemetery areas that offer sanctuary and where the presence of the deceased is not inherently suspicious. But a temporary solution is by definition unstable. As the days turned into weeks, the risk of discovery at a temporary site would increase. Forensic markers, weather, and the persistent curiosity of the public would make the initial hiding place untenable. The problem had to be moved. It had to be relocated to a place of permanent silence. This is where the rental vehicle enters the narrative. The car was not rented for leisure. The family was under siege by the global press and had little use for holiday excursions. The car was rented, according to this theory, to serve as a transport vessel for the second stage of the operation, the relocation of the evidence from the town to the wilderness. The forensic evidence found within the luggage compartment of the vehicle supports this timeline of delayed transfer. As previously established, the cadaver dog alerted to the biological scent in the boot. But it was the DNA analysis that provided the mathematical anchor for the dog's reaction. The Forensic Science Service analyzed the biological material found on the carpet of the trunk. The results were categorized as complex and low-level, meaning they could not generate a full legal standard profile. However, the partial profile that emerged was staggering. 15 out of 19 specific DNA components found in the sample matched the genetic profile of the missing child. In the realm of forensic science, a match of 15 out of 19 is statistically overwhelming. While a defense attorney can argue that it is not a 100% match, a statistician would argue that the odds of such a profile belonging to a random stranger or being the result of cross-contamination from a sibling are infinitesimally small. The DNA placed the child, or rather the biological residue of the child, inside a car that was not rented until weeks after she was supposedly taken by a stranger. This fact alone dismantles the abduction theory. A kidnapper does not return weeks later to place the victim in the parents' rental car. The only people with access to that car were the parents and their inner circle. The explanation offered for this biological anomaly was the leaking groceries defense, the claim that blood and fluids from raw meat and seafood had dripped into the carpet. But this defense collapsed under linguistic scrutiny. Sandy Cameron, a close associate of the family, and a listed driver for the vehicle provided a written statement to the police regarding the use of the car. Linguistic analysts noted a peculiar shift in his terminology. Throughout the majority of his statement, he referred to the automobile formally as a vehicle. However, when the narrative reached the point of explaining the smell and the stain in the boot, his language suddenly slipped. He switched from the word vehicle to the word car. Furthermore, his tense shifted. He moved from the past tense, which he had used to describe the rest of the holiday, into the present tense when discussing the meat and the fluids. In the field of statement analysis, this is a classic marker of deception. When a person is recalling a true memory, they typically maintain a consistent past tense. When they are constructing a fabrication, the mind often shifts to the present tense because it is creating the story in the moment. The subconscious distancing changing vehicle to car suggests a desire to separate the formal innocent object from the dirty, incriminating reality of the stain. The silence of the vehicle is the silence of transit. It represents the bridge between the panic of May 2nd and the finality of the burial at Spot 1. If the car was indeed used to transport the body, it explains why the cadaver scent was present but not overwhelming. It was a secondary transfer site, not the primary scene of death. It explains the specific timing of the rental, and it aligns perfectly with the trail camera footage that would later capture the parents returning to the remote hills. They were not exploring new terrain. They were visiting the destination that the silver Renault Scenic had allowed them to reach. The car, therefore, is not a passive object. It is an accomplice. It provided the mobility necessary to convert a temporary cover-up into a permanent mystery. The DNA in the carpet and the linguistic cracks in the statement act as the twin testimonies that cannot be silenced. They tell a story of a journey that was never meant to be recorded, a night drive taken not to find a child but to hide one. And while the car was eventually returned, cleaned, and rented to others, the invisible stain of that journey remained a biological record of the final voyage of Madeleine McCann. In the theater of public perception, props are powerful things. Throughout the long televised ordeal of the search, one object became the defining symbol of the mother's grief. It was a small, pink, soft toy, a stuffed cat known to the family as Cuddle Cat. To the world watching through their screens, this toy was a heartbreaking emblem of a mother refusing to let go. It was carried everywhere. It appeared in press conferences, at vigils, and in interviews. It was clutched in hands that seemed white-knuckled with despair. The narrative was clear. This was the child's favorite possession, the transitional object that bridged the gap between the lost daughter and the waiting mother. As long as she held the cat, she held a piece of her child. However, in the eyes of an investigator like Bert Stalander, objects are not just symbols of emotion. They are carriers of evidence. In forensic science, a soft toy is a sponge. It absorbs biological material, sweat, saliva, and scent. In a true missing person case, such an object is precious not just for sentimental reasons but for investigative ones. It holds the olfactory fingerprint of the missing child, a scent that can be used to guide search dogs. To preserve the scent is to preserve the hope of a trail. To destroy the scent is to sever the link. Approximately 2 months after the disappearance, a seemingly minor event occurred that sent shockwaves through the analytical community observing the case. Kate McCann washed Cuddle Cat. When asked by a journalist why she had chosen to clean this sacred relic of her daughter, her answer was blunt and practical. She said it smelled. She claimed it had become dirty from constant handling and needed to be laundered. On the surface, this is a reasonable domestic explanation, but placed within the context of a criminal investigation involving a potential death, it is a catastrophic destruction of evidence. Stalander focused intently on this action. He asked the uncomfortable question, what exactly did the toy smell of? If the child had been abducted alive, the toy would simply smell of a child, a scent that a grieving mother would typically be desperate to preserve, not wash away. Parents of missing children often seal such items in bags to keep the smell of their child alive for as long as possible. They do not scrub it out with detergent. The urge to wash the toy suggests that the scent emanating from it was not the comforting smell of a living girl, but the distressing, unmistakable odor of something else. If the theory of the accident on May 2nd is correct, and if the body was concealed for a period of time before being moved, it is highly probable that the toy was present during the immediate aftermath of the death. Soft fabric retains the volatile organic compounds released during the early stages of the event. This scent, known as chemical compounds, is potent, distinctive, and notoriously difficult to mask. Even a microscopic transfer of fluids or a lingering exposure to the environment of death would taint the object. By washing the toy, the mother was performing an act of forensic erasure. Whether this was a calculated move to destroy DNA and scent markers, or a subconscious reaction to a smell that triggered guilt and horror, the result was the same. The evidence was drowned in soapy water. The biological connection to her final moments was obliterated, leaving behind a sterile, clean object that looked the same but told a different story. Psychologically, this act aligns with the concept of defensive guilt. It is a form of compartmentalization. The conscious mind says, "I am washing this because it is dirty." The subconscious mind says, "I am washing this because it reminds me of the reality I am trying to deny." It is an act of undoing a psychological defense mechanism, where a person attempts to symbolically reverse an unhealthy or threatening reality by engaging in a cleansing ritual. By scrubbing the toy, she was not just cleaning fabric, she was attempting to scrub away the memory of the event that contaminated it. The washing of Cuddle Cat also served a narrative purpose. It allowed the object to remain a prop in the public eye without the risk of it becoming a liability in the private sphere. If a cadaver dog had been introduced to the unwashed toy, the reaction could have been immediate and damning. By cleaning it, the object was neutralized. It could continue to be held in front of cameras as a symbol of hope while secretly having been stripped of the truth it once held. This incident illustrates the profound duality of the parents' behavior throughout the case. There is the public performance, the grieving mother holding the token of her lost daughter, and the private reality, the woman who destroys the very essence of that token to protect a secret. It is a paradox of holding on and pushing away. She clung to the visual image of the cat, but she could not bear the olfactory reality of it. For Stelander, the wash toy was a tragedy in itself. It was the final betrayal of the investigation. The silence of the witnesses was one thing. The silencing of the physical evidence was another. The toy could have spoken for the child. It could have told the dogs where she had been and what had happened to her. Instead, it was silenced by a cycle of the washing machine, reduced from a piece of critical evidence to a mere prop in a stage play. The scent of truth was washed away, replaced by the artificial scent of detergent, leaving the world with an image of comfort that was in reality a monument to erasure. In the vast, sprawling narrative of the disappearance, there is one fortress that has never been breached. It is not a physical structure, but a psychological one. It is the silence of the Tapas 7. In the history of modern criminal investigation, it is almost unheard of for a group of 7 independent witnesses to maintain a unified front for nearly 2 decades. Human nature is volatile. Friendships fracture, guilt erodes resolve, and the pressure of a global mystery usually forces at least one crack in the dam. Yet in this case, the wall has remained absolute. Not one member of the dining group has ever deviated from the core script. Not one has sold their story to the press. Not one has whispered a contradiction that led to a breakthrough. Bert Stelander viewed this silence not as a testament to innocence, but as a symptom of what he called psychological entrapment. The public often wonders why, if a cover-up occurred, no one has come forward to confess. They imagine that the weight of the secret would be unbearable. But Stelander argued that the dynamic is far more complex than simple guilt. It is a calculation of survival. The group consisted of intelligent, successful professionals, many of them working in the medical field. They had reputations, careers, and families to protect. If the theory of the accident and subsequent concealment is true, then every adult at that table became complicit the moment they agreed to support the official timeline. Whether they actively participated in the movement of the body or simply agreed to look the other way, they crossed a line from which there is no return. To speak now, after 17 years, would not be an act of liberation. It would be an act of self-destruction. It would mean the end of their medical licenses. It would mean facing criminal charges for perverting the course of justice. It would mean social ostracization and the collapse of their personal lives. They are trapped in a state of mutually assured destruction. If one falls, they all fall. Therefore, the silence is not maintained by loyalty to the parents, but by fear for themselves. They are not protecting a friend, they are protecting their own existence. This is the glue that holds the conspiracy together, not love, but the terrifying pragmatism of self-preservation. Stalander also applied the theory of groupthink to the seven. When a group is placed under immense stress, the desire for consensus overrides the desire for truth. In the days following the disappearance, as the police pressure mounted and the media besieged the resort, the group likely formed a psychological bunker. They convinced themselves that their version of events was the only reality that mattered. Over time, the lie becomes the truth in their own minds. They stop remembering the event as it happened and start remembering the statement they gave. The rehearsal becomes the memory. But while the witnesses remained silent, the behavior of the parents continued to speak. The investigation of Stalander culminates not in a courtroom, but in the return to the hillside. The trail camera footage provides the final haunting coda to the story. In one specific clip, analyzed frame by frame, Jerry McCann is seen walking away from the shrine at spot 1. He does not just walk, he pauses. He reaches down and brushes his hand against a specific stone at the edge of the heart-shaped formation. This gesture is microscopic in the grand scale of the case, but it is monumental in its meaning. It is a tactile interaction with the site. You do not touch a random rock on a random hill with such tenderness. You touch a headstone. You touch a memorial. The gesture was a private communion, a moment where the public mask dropped and the father acknowledged the reality of what lay beneath the symbols. It was a confession made without a single word being spoken. The legal case remains in a state of purgatory. Without a body, without a confession, and without forensic certainty, the authorities are paralyzed. The file sits in a cabinet, officially open but functionally frozen. But for those who have followed the trail of silence, the case is resolved. The truth does not live in the police files. It lives in the discrepancies of the timeline and the scent found by the dogs in the washed toy and in the stones on the hill. The tragedy of Madeleine McCann is not just that she died, but that she was erased. Her death was denied to facilitate a story of abduction. She was denied a funeral, a grave, and the dignity of the truth. Instead, she became a ghost story, a face on a poster, a pawn in a game of narrative control. As the years roll on, the Tappa 7 grow older. The parents grow older. The world moves on to new mysteries. But the hillside remains. The stones at spot 1 may eventually scatter, the flower may wither, and the letter M may fade into the earth. But the memory of what happened there is etched into the landscape. The silence of the hillside is not empty. It is full. It is full of the answers that the world was denied. And perhaps in the end, that is the only justice available, the knowledge that while they can hide the body and they can hide the story, they can never hide the place where they said goodbye. The earth remembers even when the people refuse to speak.